Okay. So we are actually doing chapter 8 of Daniel today. So chapter 8 is what we will be looking at. And for those of you who have been attending regularly, you would remember that till chapter 6, Daniel actually the book of Daniel talks about some of the events that happened in Daniel's life and also the life of his three friends. But from chapter 7, the book is full of prophecies, nothing but just prophecies. God revealed certain things to Daniel. Some of the things have already happened, word to word has been fulfilled. Some of the things are yet to happen. And when we look at the scriptures, this is where we find our confidence and comfort, right? That God, who has fulfilled all the promises of the past, will continue to fulfill all the promises that he has made for the future. The prophecies, all of them will be fulfilled. So we are looking at chapter 8 today, and I wanted to make one comment about chapter 8. The prophecies recorded in chapter 8, from an earthly perspective, most of them, in fact, all of them have been fulfilled. But the prophecies of chapter 8 also have a future connotation, a future reference, especially during the tribulation. And for those of you who attended the Revelation study, I will be talking a little bit about the tribulation that we did in Revelation. But for those of you who could not attend the Revelation study, do not worry. I will also be making it, mentioning it in a way so that it is clear to you as well. So we are looking at Daniel chapter 8 today. Remember, most of the prophecies of chapter 8 have already happened, but they also have reference to the future, especially in terms of the Antichrist and what will happen during the tribulation time. So let us read Daniel chapter 8. We'll begin by reading verses 1 to 14. In the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came towards the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, four prominent horns grew up toward the four winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. He said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be consecrated. So when you look from verses 1 to 14, this is the vision that Daniel saw. And before I make a few comments on this vision, some lessons that we can learn, let me just in a simple way talk to you about what is there in the vision. So remember, the reason these visions use a lot of symbolical language is very simple. Why? Because symbolism will mean the same thing. The meaning is intact. When somebody uses symbolical languages, the meaning is intact irrespective of time, irrespective of culture, irrespective of which era it is. So that is the reason when God gives these revelation, when he gave these revelation to his servants, he did not use clear words. He did not write as if history books. He used these symbols, he used these images. Why? Because images have less chance of misunderstanding. In other words, images would mean the same thing in different era, and as a result, these messages from God became messages that were locked in a capsule, transferring from era to era, transferring from generation to generation, so that the meaning is not lost. We can understand what it actually means. Okay. So yes, they are confusing. Yes, a lot of times we don't know what it is, but remember, it was very needed for prophecies to be transferred like this, so that there is no room for misunderstanding, and that the meaning is not lost over time. So that is the reason why prophecies are written in this way. Now, when you look at this prophecy of Daniel in chapter 8, Daniel talks about two animals. One is a ram and one is a goat. The ram is very powerful. It has two horns, the Bible says. In fact, one horn is larger than the other horn. The goat also becomes very great. So the ram was at the peak of its glory, and suddenly a goat comes, and the goat attacks the ram and completely destroys the ram. And then the Bible says the goat actually had four horns, and especially when you look from verses 8, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power the large horn was broken off. So remember, this one goat with destroys the ram, and this goat has four horns, and then the large horn was broken up, and in its place four prominent horns come. Okay, so this one goat with one horn defeats the lamb, and then one large horn is broken up, and in the place of the large horn these four prominent horns grow. Now in verse 9 the Bible says, out of the four prominent horns, there is one, a small horn, but it grew in power. So out of the four, then suddenly one horn comes that grows in power. And verse 10 says, it grew until it reached the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. Okay. Now, the thing about this prophecy is that the angel actually explains to Daniel what this prophecy means. Okay, so we will look at some of the key lessons, and then from verses 15 onwards, we will see what the prophecy means. Now, one of the lessons that we learn about this prophecy is the Bible says the vision that Daniel received was before the events of Daniel chapter 5. So, again, remember last time when we did chapter 7, that vision Daniel got during Belshazzar's reign. The vision of chapter 8 he gets during Belshazzar's reign. And in chapter 5 is where we have recorded that Belshazzar dies, right? He was a king who was very proud, rebelled against God, had total disregard, disrespect for God, and he dies. And remember, in chapter 5 is where the hand appears on the wall, right? Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. That's what happens in chapter 5. Now, the visions of chapter 7 and chapter 8 actually happened before the events of chapter 5. Okay, and so though the visions are written later, but please remember the events happened before chapter 5. The other thing that we learn from this vision is Susa was more than 200 miles from Babylon. Okay, Daniel was transported there in the vision. Remember, chapter 8, the vision that Daniel is seeing is actually in the citadel of Susa, which actually was in Persia. So remember, Daniel is in Babylon. God actually transports Daniel to Susa, which is in Persia, around 200 miles from Daniel, because that is where God is showing this vision to Daniel. Why did God take him to Susa? The reason God took him to Susa, because the prophecy was about the future kingdom, which was actually the kingdom of Persia, and Susa was the capital of Persia at that point of time. Okay, remember at that point Susa was not a very major kingdom. Babylon was still at the peak of its power, and then God is actually talking about this thing about Susa becoming the one of the main cities in the future Persian Empire. The other thing that we learn is Susa will become the capital of the Persian Empire. In fact, Esther talks about the citadel of Susa as well. So when you read the book of Esther, again, the book of Esther is in the Persian context. So Esther is recorded for us. And in the book of Esther, we see how God talks about the fact that Esther was actually there in the citadel of Susa. Okay. So Daniel and all of these things have happened before Esther. So just to give you a context of how these kind of line up. Okay. Now let's read verses 15 to 27. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and I fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, so this is one of those visions where angel Gabriel actually clearly explains to Daniel what the vision was. So he says, who was that two-horned ram? It was actually the kings of the Media and the Persia. Okay. And then he goes on to says, the shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between the eyes is the first king. Who was the first king of Greece? That was Alexander the Great, right? So this prophecy is actually about Alexander the Great taking over again Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king, that is Alexander the Great. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation but will not have the same power. Now, in history, we know this is what history records. When Alexander dies, his kingdom, the mighty Greek Empire, was divided among his four generals, right? And this prophecy was given to Daniel hundreds of years before Alexander and Greece came into the picture. For us, because we know its history, we recognize how possible it is. But please remember, when God is giving a vision about Greece, Greece was nowhere in the picture. Nobody would even think that Greece would become a superpower at one point of time. It's almost like telling some of the weaker nations now that, say, 100 years from now, they will become the superpower, and the superpowers would be just thrown out of their glory. It's almost like that. So when Daniel received this vision hundreds of years before anything happened with Greece or with Alexander, God had already given this vision of the shaggy goat who destroys the ram, the two-horned ram that was the Persian Empire. And then once the shaggy goat, I mean the horn, one of the horns dies, is broken, then the four horns of the four generals replace him. Okay, verse 23. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce looking king, a master of intrigue will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and morning that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision, and it was beyond understanding. Okay, so this is the condition that Daniel faced after seeing the vision. Now, what do we learn about this vision? Okay, now let me just quickly mention to you once again about the kingdom of Persia, the kingdom of Greece, especially. So, here it says the ram with two horns is the Medes and the Persian Empire. And again, remember the Bible says how one horn was longer than the other horn, which symbolizes that the long horn was, symbolizing the more powerful Persian Empire, and the small horn was actually the Medes Empire. Okay, the empire of Media. The next thing you recognize, the goat with a prominent horn is Greece and Alexander. So Alexander is the prominent horn, and then the four horns were the four kingdoms ruled by Alexander's four generals. That is Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus. Okay, so these are the four generals who finally took over Alexander's kingdom after he died. So these are all prophecies that have been fulfilled. Now, when you look at these prophecies, so we know that the prophecy about Persia is fulfilled, the prophecy about Greece is fulfilled, but there is another thing about this prophecy, right? The prophecy also talks about in the latter part, a fierce looking king, a master of intrigue will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. So now when you look at this explanation of the prophecy, Gabriel actually talks about this king who will come later, and we will actually look at that king. But when you look at it from a kingdom perspective, okay, you had Babylon. After Babylon was Persia. After Persia was Greece. And after Greece was actually Rome. Okay, so the Roman Empire became a very mighty empire during that period. So all of those prophecies happened one after the other. Now, what is this person, this fierce looking king? Who is this fierce looking king, and why is such a frightening prophecy given about this king? Okay, he's a master of intrigue. He will make sure that deception prospers under him. So it is a very, very scary prophecy about this king. Now, for this, we will depend a little bit on history, because please remember, each of the prophecies have been fulfilled in history. The reason we have to depend about it in history is because the Bible doesn't mention about this king. In fact, the Bible doesn't mention about a long period between Malachi and Matthew. Okay, so between Malachi and Matthew, the Bible doesn't mention. There's the silent period, is what most commentators say. So when the book of Malachi was written, which is the last book of the Old Testament, and the book of Matthew was written, which is the first book of the New Testament, remember, between Malachi and Jesus' coming to earth, there was almost a 400 period of silence, which means God did not speak anything, God did not reveal anything. But please remember, just because God did not speak or give revelation does not mean that God was not active in human history. In that silent period also, God was active. So the reason it is called the silent period, especially between Malachi until the coming of the Messiah, it's called silent period because God did not give any new revelation to the people. Now it is in this silent period that the prophecies of Daniel, especially regarding this fearsome king who will come, gets fulfilled. And for those of you who attended the Revelation study, you would remember that this fierce looking king, the description of this king almost matches that of the Antichrist when he comes in the picture in the time of the tribulation. That's what Revelation says. Okay, now let us look at who this king was, who this fierce looking, a master of deception. Under him, deception, evil prospered. This is who the king was. According to history, the small hall that grew in power is the evil tyrant king Antiochus Epiphanes of Syria. Antiochus Epiphanes is considered to be one of the most evil kings in the history of mankind. Okay, he was very, very evil, almost like Nero, okay, of the New Testament, the guy who was very, very responsible to kill most of the apostles, Emperor Nero, evil king. So Antiochus Epiphanes is actually that king that this prophecy is talking about, the small horn that grew in power. Who is the small horn? Remember that when Alexander defeats the Persian Empire, after the one horn, Alexander dies, four other horns take his place as four generals. Out of these four horns comes a smaller horn that grew in power, and that is the evil tyrant king Antiochus Epiphanes. It is said that he hated the Jews, murdered, and tortured them. So, when you look at the explanation that Gabriel is giving to Daniel, what is the explanation he gives? One of the explanation that he gives is he will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. Next, he says, especially in verse 24, he says, he will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people, which actually is a reference to the Jews. So God already revealed to Daniel that there will come an evil king, Antiochus Epiphanes, who will hate the Jews, who are God's holy people. He will murder them and torture them. So remember, in that silent period between Malachi and the coming of Jesus, in that silent period is where we have King Antiochus Epiphanes, about whom Daniel receives that prophecy. He defiled the temple by sacrificing a pig on that altar and placed the statue of Jupiter inside the Holy of Holies. Remember, God continuously had said to the Israelites how holy the temple should be, right? There were laws and regulations to maintain the sanctity of the temple. But this Antiochus Epiphanes, he so hated the Jews. And remember, in history, people have always hated the Jews. Why? Because the Jews are God's own people. And so Satan has manipulated the minds of people. Satan has manipulated the minds of human beings to actually attack the Jews. Started with Pharaoh, Egypt, right? Started with there. You see Antiochus Epiphanes doing the same thing. We also see during Xerxes' time, during Esther's time, we have the same problem that happens there. Mordecai and Esther together try to save the Jews, one after the other. We recognize that kingdoms have always been against the Jews. Why? Because they are God's own people, apple of God's eyes, and Satan has always manipulated human beings to destroy them. And then we know in the recent past, the Holocaust of the Nazis, really, really difficult time for the Jews. And even now, there are so many people in the world who are so against the Jews, right? So here we have the evil king Antiochus Epiphanes. He defiled the temple by sacrificing a pig on that altar and placed the statue of Jupiter inside the Holy of Holies. Now, when we read Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, okay, Jesus talks about an abomination that causes desolation. Now, when Antiochus Epiphanes did this thing during his time, by sacrificing a pig on that altar of God. And remember, pig was an unclean animal for the Jews. It is still an unclean animal for the Jews. He defiled the temple of God. Jesus says that, listen, this, they used to call it the abomination that causes desolation. So that is what is the name of, that event. Jesus said that this same event, the abomination that causes desolation, that happened during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, will also happen during the time of the Antichrist, right? It will happen during the time of the Antichrist, when the Antichrist himself will place his statue as to be worshipped in the temple in Jerusalem. He will defile the temple, and the Antichrist will try and bring one world religion. So when Jesus talks about the abomination that causes desolation in Matthew 24:15, number one, he's giving a reference to what Antiochus Epiphanes did, but he's also warning the people, the church, his children, that remember, in the future there will also be an Antichrist who will again repeat the abomination that causes desolation. The other thing you remember, the Bible says, Daniel actually asked, right, how long will this continue? And verse 14 says, he said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be consecrated, reconsecrated. That is found in verse 14. So when Antiochus Epiphanes defiles the temple, according to angel Gabriel, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. That means around 2,300 days, which is roughly around between 6.5 years to 7 years, right? That is the time period that the angel Gabriel tells Daniel, that is the time it will take for the temple to be reconsecrated, to be re-sanctified, for Antiochus Epiphanes to be completely defeated and removed from power. And let me tell you, that is exactly what happened. Remember, all of the prophecies of the Bible have been fulfilled. I mean, not all, I mean, most of the prophecies of the Bible have been fulfilled, and the ones that are not yet fulfilled will be fulfilled till Jesus comes back. Okay, so everything that God has said is fulfilled in human history, and that's the beauty of the Bible, right? That is something that is so amazing and intriguing about it. So this 2,300 days, after which the temple was finally reconsecrated and re-sanctified, that was actually done by a guy called Judas Maccabee. Okay, so Judas Maccabee and his army of Jewish patriots took back Jerusalem and rededicated the temple. So every time there is an evil tyrant king, there will always be rebels who will stand up, right? So in that time, there was this guy called Judas Maccabee. In fact, his father was one of the priests during that point of time when Antiochus Epiphanes was actually doing whatever he wanted to do. He was defiling the temple, all of that he was doing. And Judas Maccabees' father was the one who showed a lot of courage to stand against Antiochus Epiphanes. And so Judas Maccabees actually took that from his father. He was not alone, his brothers were there, and he took an army of Jewish patriots and they took back Jerusalem and rededicated the temple. In fact, when you look at the Bible used by the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church has a few extra books in their Old Testament. One of two, the books that they have in the Old Testament is the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, where they actually talk about what happened during the silent period. Okay, when God did not give a revelation through word, but God was still active, and God used a person like Judas Maccabees after 2,300 days of the defilement. After 2,300 days, that is when Judas Maccabees stood up, and then he was able to defeat Antiochus and take back Jerusalem and rededicated the temple and reconsecrated the temple. Okay, so remember, though the Bible is silent in this period between Malachi and the coming of Jesus, God was still active, and each of the prophecies that happened in the silent period was already revealed to Daniel at that point of time. Daniel definitely did not understand anything at that point of time, because Daniel himself says, what I saw was beyond my understanding. But because we have seen history now, we know that that is how the prophecies fit. Now, when Judas Maccabees and his army were able to take back the temple, they did something very, very interesting. They instituted something called the Feast of Dedication. That is, when they took back the temple, they wanted to rededicate it to God, rededicate it to Yahweh God. And so every year, they started doing something called the dedication of the temple, the Feast of Dedication. That is what they began to do every year since that time. Okay. And the day when they did the Feast of Dedication was actually 25th December, 165 BC. So it was almost more than 150 years before Christ, on 25th December, that the Jews started celebrating what they now call the Feast of Dedication. They still celebrate it now. And as a result, remember, when hundreds of years later, when Christmas began to be celebrated on the 25th of December, for a lot of the people who are coming from different backgrounds, Christian faith, different Christian faith they came, for them it was just easy to take 25th December. Why? Because for the Jewish believers, 25th December, they already celebrated the Feast of Dedication. So they said, fine, let Christ's birth be on the 25th of December. For the pagan believers, a lot of them believe that Mithra, the god of sun, god of Ra, was born on 25th December. So they said, well, we already worship somebody who's related to the sun, but we are worshiping the true light now, the true Son of God. And so 25th December began to be celebrated as the birth of Jesus Christ. We all know that Jesus was not born on 25th December. It is just a symbolic remembrance and celebration of the fact that the Son of God became a Son of Man. And the reason 25th December has been accepted mostly by all people except for the Eastern churches, they celebrated on the 16th of January, is because for most of the religious backgrounds at that point of time, 25th December was a special day. For the Jews, it was the Feast of Dedication. For the pagans, it was the birth of their the god of the sun, that is Mithra. And as a result, they thought it would just be right to worship the true God on the 25th of December. Okay, so this is a little bit about the silent period and what actually happened in terms of Antiochus Epiphanes and the small horn that the Bible talks about. But please remember, before I actually hand over the time again to Pastor Bhagirathi, Antiochus was just a foreshadow of the Antichrist. Remember, the Old Testament is a foreshadow of the Messiah and his work of salvation. For example, look at the laws. The laws are so complicated, the laws are so minute, the laws are so difficult to follow. How is it that a foreshadow? It is a foreshadow because then people understand that we cannot please God, we cannot get salvation just by obeying the law. We have to depend on somebody, on God's grace. And Jesus became, the personification of God's grace, and Jesus extended that grace and love to us. So remember, everything that happens in the Old Testament is a foreshadow of what happened in Calvary, is a foreshadow of the work of salvation, and is a foreshadow of what God will do in the future. So likewise, for Antiochus, he was the foreshadow of the Antichrist. So though a lot of the prophecies of chapter 8 have already been fulfilled, we recognize that in Antichrist, they will again be repeated, they will again be fulfilled. Okay, when you look at the prophecies about Antiochus, they also apply to Antichrist. Just like Antiochus, the Antichrist will torture the Jews and defile the temple. That is the abomination that causes desolation that will happen the second time. The first time Antiochus did it, the second time the Antichrist will do it. The other thing we need to remember, verse 25, Daniel says, when they feel secure, he will destroy many. What does it mean? It is actually alluding or talking about, the Antichrist posing as the peacemaker for the first 3.5 years of tribulation. Please remember that the tribulation will last for 7 years, according to the book of Revelation. For the first 3.5 years, this Antichrist will pose as a peacemaker. Why? Because he's trying to replicate what Christ did, right? That is why he's the Antichrist. He will come as the false peacemaker, and that is when the Bible says, when they feel secure, he will destroy many, which means after the 1.5 years, 3.5 years, after the 3.5 years, everybody will think that this is this is the Messiah of the world. He's bringing peace. Right when they feel secure, that is when he will change to becoming a tyrant. And the last 3.5 years of tribulation, that is when it will start, and it will be a very, very terrible time for those who will be here on earth. And finally, the Bible says, especially in this prophecy, the Bible says that the tribulation will last for 7 years, but this Antichrist will not be destroyed by human power. When you look at verses 25, this is what he says. He will cause deceit to prosper. Okay, that is what will happen during his reign, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes, which is Jesus. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power, which means that when he will be destroyed, obviously Antichrist will not be destroyed by human power. It is the real Christ who will destroy him in the battle of Armageddon, as we find in Revelation chapter 19. So for chapter 8 of Daniel, a lot of the prophecies have been fulfilled, but each of these prophecies, especially the one concerning the Antichrist, is yet to be fulfilled. Though we see a lot of them having been fulfilled in Antiochus, but he is just a foreshadow of the Antichrist. And when we look the other, the next week, the coming weeks, when we look at the other chapters from Daniel, we will see how the Bible continues to talk about the Antichrist, the last times, the end times, and the tribulation, and what it would mean for the people of God. Okay, so I think this is something that we need to remember. And in fact, when we look at next week, we won't come back. When we come back the following Wednesday, we will look from chapter 9, and it is very interesting that we know that the Jews finally went back. They rebuilt the temple of Jerusalem under Ezra and Nehemiah, right? We know it happened. Daniel received that prophecy as well. That prophecy was revealed to Jeremiah as well. So we will also look at certain portions from Jeremiah, where we recognize that everything that happened in accordance to God's plan. Nothing took him by surprise, and it's just beautiful to see how God has orchestrated his plan in human history. So with that, we end chapter 8, which did talk about the past, but like I said, it also talks about the future. So for us, children of God, we need to be very mindful of it. We should not take our faith for granted, but always work towards strengthening it and maturing in faith. Over to Pastor Bhagirathi. He would be facilitating the time for discussions.